Just is because you risk misleading the people who are dearest to you, and you should be very careful what you say when you're talking to people you care about. Enemies you can mislead, so not your friends. Okay, so let's just recollect a little bit, and then start to talk again. So the two commandments, which we were looking at, are useful places to start, not just because they're historically important, but because they quickly raise a whole set of issues that have become, central to the discussion of love. Taking the second commandment first, love your neighbor as yourself, well, we saw a bunch of things that raised about what kind of love is involved. How are we supposed to, in some sense, extend it from ourselves to others? What is the kind of love that we have for ourselves? Is that kind of love the sort that we have for ourselves on the supposition that we do and that everybody somehow has it? Is that something that can be commanded? Right? Is it under our control? And that issue of control becomes a central one. So just kind of riffing off on the left hand for a second, you might think that issues of control, never mind about, even when they're focused on love, but just in general, issues of control are extraordinarily important ones, right? Why? Well, whenever we want to control something, especially something that maybe it's very difficult to control, right? We indicate a kind of attitude we have to our own vulnerability and risk. So take the following. It can be very upsetting to discover that you can't make another person love you. You love them, and you want them to love you back. And when you discover that actually you might not be able to get them to do it, there's a built-in kind of tendency to think that you can somehow or other force them, coerce them, make them do it, as we say. Right? And we know where that can lead to, if we're talking about sexual love, right? It can lead to unpleasant things for both parties. But that's a very common sort of word. But you might even think that when we talk about control, it's typically, not always, but interestingly, it's a kind of, here's a way to make it a gender question, it's a kind of way in which you might think men want to control women because they want what it's in, otherwise they might not get from them. So you might see not just the local case of where, you want somebody to love you back, and you can't make them, but you might also be thinking of a way that a social world might be organized to ensure a supply of willing sources of the thing that you most want. So imagine that you socialized women into thinking that love was their whole life and their real self-realization dependent on their finding a man to love. You might think, oh, gee, that'd be handy. Right, men were thinking, well, this will ensure a ready supply of what it is we want. See, when we think about control, right, and issues of the will, we're always thinking about ways in which we can find ourselves vulnerable and then react to it by thinking that we can get rid of the vulnerability, where we push it out and take over and control. So that was one thing. Then we flipped it over and we looked at the first commandment, love God with your whole heart, soul, and mind. And we saw ways in which thinkers like Kierkegaard and Kant, we didn't look too closely at Kant, but we looked just a little bit at Kierkegaard, thought that maybe that first commandment could sort of provide you with a way of thinking about the second one, right, which is what we love in each other, if our love is the good sort that Kierkegaard likes, right, is the reflection of a perfect being of God in each of us. So what I love when I love you, right, as I see God reflected on you, and vice versa. And when I love myself, it's the same thing. And the worry there is that one's kind of first short-circuiting the process too much. So when we want to be loved for ourselves, it's not because we're a little mirror or something. Right? That's the thought. And I asked you to just take a look at a little bit of the Nicomachean Ethics. I don't know if you did it, but if you did, you see that Aristotle plays out this issue when he asks, well, what is self-love? He says some people think it's It's something you should criticize for people for. They've got too much self-love. That is, they put themselves first, right? Too much. And he says, yeah, but that's just because when people criticize you for that, it's because they've made a mistake about the self. The real self, the self that is really in your interest to focus on, is the rational self. And though we don't see it in that little chapter, a little bit later in the Ethics, he'll say that that's the divine thing in us, that the rational part of our souls or self is divine. It's a little chip off the divine block, a little bit of godlike stuff in us. And in a way, that makes it very close to the kind of Kierkegaardian. So what I encouraged you to think was, we have two sort of pictures. Self-love, that brings in both love and the self. And that raises the question of which one should be used as a lever to get us insight into the other. Should we use the fact that love focuses on the self to guide us to the self, because it's what love focuses on? Or should we use the fact that we know what the self is to tell us what love is? And we don't know the answer to which one of those should come first. Okay, so that's kind of some of the major themes. Coercion, what the true self is. Can love be commanded? Is there a question of economy in love, which the first commandment raises? Is there enough love to go around? Well, the thought is, one way you could think of the Christian commandments is, love is cheap. It's cheap enough that you have enough to give everyone, right? It's just there. You you make it up, right? Just give it out, and that doesn't comport well with our thought about its value, right? Because when we think about actually how love plays out in our lives, it tends to be quite selective, like friendship, right? If somebody told you they had 5,000 friends, right, you would probably think that none of them could be very deep. Right? I'm not talking about Facebook friends or just people who friend you, right? But actually real friends, close friends, as we say. I've just invited 5,000 close friends over. Well, I mean, if you think about how much time one or two close friends take up in your life, the idea that you could have 5,000 of them, well, so just think about partitioning your week into giving each of them a little bit of phone time, right? It just seems absurd, right? And let me just read you what Freud says about that. So I put it on the back of the handout about the two commandments. And this is the very last one. Would it be good to obey the commandments? You sort of could easily find yourself thinking that obviously it would. It'd be great if we all loved everybody. And Freud is not so sure about that. The commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself, is the strongest defense against human aggressiveness, and an excellent example of the unpsychological expectations of the cultural superego, or just what you are formed to think. The commandment is impossible to fulfill. Such an enormous inflation of love can only lower its value, not get rid of its difficulty. Civilization pays no attention at all to this. It merely admonishes us that the harder it is to obey the precept, the more meritorious it is to do so. But anyone who follows such a precept in present-day civilization only puts himself at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the person who disregards it. What a potent obstacle to civilization aggressiveness must be if the defense against it can cause as much unhappiness as the aggressiveness itself. Natural ethics, as it's called, has nothing to offer here except the narcissistic satisfaction of being able to think oneself better than others. At this point, the ethics based on religion introduces its promises of a better afterlife. But so long as virtue is not rewarded here on earth, ethics will, I fancy, preach in vain. I too think it quite certain that a real change in the relations of human beings to possessions would be of more help in this direction than any ethical demands. But the recognition of this fact among socialists has been obscured and made useless for practical purposes by a fresh idealistic misconception of human nature. There's a lot to think about in that passage, and we're not going to do it now. You're going to do it, think about it, see what you can make of all the different little elements there are in the passage of Freud thinks. It wouldn't be good to obey these commandments. The only effect it would be to cheapen the commodity, not to make life better. Okay, so that's a recollection of last time. Now, let's see what you want to talk about from what we were looking at for today. And of course, the syllabus is a little off on the days because of the snow day, but I take it you can revise them. Yeah.
I want to talk about coercion.
Say again?
Coercion. Like forcing.
Coercion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it says like that it's like almost impossible to like force someone to love you. But what about situations like Stockholm syndrome and stuff like that, where like there's like a kidnapper and like there's a really good movie about this.
Yeah.
By Almodovar.
Yeah.
On Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down.
Yeah.
That like basically he like kidnaps this lady and he's in love with her, and by the end of the movie he falls in love with him.
Yeah.
Like how does that develop?
That's a really interesting question. I hadn't really thought of that. I mean, we do know there are strategies or things that you can do that may have the effect of getting another person to love you. And something like Stockholm Syndrome is a case of that, where people identify with their captors. But if you thought about it, maybe you could think this way, right? That there are strategies that love mustn't employ. So let me give an example, and then you'll see what the worry is. So suppose there's a love drug. I mean, suppose there's a little blue pill that you can give people, and if you give it to them, they tend to, as in the magic stories, fall in love with the first person they see, right? It usually goes wrong, because you're not the first one they see, right? But nonetheless, that's the idea. You might think, though, that undermines something about love, right? It might be that the thought is that it does something like this, that because you're coercing, you're not getting what you want. So let me give the theological example. It's always very useful to think about what happens when you make this part of religion, because then you get a lot of thought expressed, but not quite so distorted by human relations. So here's the idea. Why doesn't God just make a whole lot of robots? Robotic people like us, none of whom can help loving him. So we've all got Stockholm Syndrome, right? We've all, as it were, taken the blue pill. But that seems to be just what you don't want. You want to be not just loved for yourself, but freely loved. So if I coerce, I undermine, right? So for example, suppose in order to get you to love me, I lie about myself. Common, of course, right? I tell you some story about myself that attracts you, gets you into my orbit, right? You see me in this way. But I've got to think that your love is failing to find its target, right? Because I've distorted the target. So that's a worry if we move into the thought that if you do try to coerce it, you seem to undercut the value of the very thing that you want. Right? It's a bit like being loved for your money. Right?
Well, but I think, I don't know, I may be wrong, but I think there's a lot of humans that, like, being loved for your money, for example, like, I think there's a lot of people that would just would be happy with that.
Uh-huh.
So, I think that we say, like, oh, we love to be loved freely.
Yeah.
But do we really mean that?
Yeah, so notice there are two different thoughts here, right? So one is, what's the object, right? Is it the money or me? And the other is it a free response to that value, or is it a somehow coerced response? So notice that in the case of the money, so it's a bit like being loved by your money. It's not quite the same, right? Because your love of money might be a free expression of your values rather than something coerced. So you could love the wrong thing but love it in the right way, or you could love the right thing but love it in the wrong way, right? So you have to get those wired up. Now, so we'll take your thought, right? Maybe you were going to respond to this. That lots of people would think, oh yeah, I don't care whether she loves me for my money or my, pretty blue eyes or whatever. I don't care, right? That gets the person to be in my orbit, live with me, do all kinds of things that I might want. Yeah, were you going to respond to that?
Yeah, or I was going to say something along the lines of what you said.
Yeah.
Is that like the tension in that question is between like what's essential and what is like procedural. So like money is money something essential about you that like someone can love? Like, I don't know, that's be like their values. Like, do you love success?
Two money
do you love
lovers
power, that kind of
having, so that's the thought is that might be a shared value may be two people who just think it is all about money and achievement and success, and we're in it together, and we know that, we're not hiding it. And what attracts us to each other is that we're both really good at making it, and we make a lot together, and then we can spend it on stuff we want, and that kind of thought. So that could be a version of being loved for yourself, right? Because your true self will be reflected in your relationship, as opposed to the case where you coerce, right? Is that roughly where we want to?
Yeah, but I think it's also hard. It's hard to say what is a part of you and what is something.
I think this is so this is the one that, if you like, Aristotle raises, and in a way the first commandment does by talking about heart, soul, and mind. You might think, well, God says, well, whatever you do your loving with, whether it's your heart, soul, or your mind, love me with that. But the very fact of raising parts of you raises a question of, when I want to be loved for myself, which part is that? And then you see